Hi, sweetie. Got another story for you. This one's called the Dimmocks. See? Here we go. A full surgery, but the ripple of satisfaction as I surveyed the packed rows of heads waned quickly as realization dawned. It was only the Dimmocks again. I first encountered the Dimmocks one evening when I had a call to a dog which had been knocked down by a car. The address was down in the old part of town, and I was cruising slowly along the row of decaying cottages looking for the number when a door burst open and 3 shock-headed little children ran into the street and waved me down frantically. "He's in here, mister," they gasped in unison as I got out, and then began immediately to put me in the picture. "It's Bonzo. Aye, a car hit him. We had to carry him in, mister." They all got their words in as I opened the garden gate and struggled up the path, with the 3 of them hanging on to my arms and tugging at my coat. And en route, I gazed in wonder at the window of the house, where a mass of other young faces mouthed at me. A tangle of arms gesticulated. Once through the door, which opened directly into the living room, I was swamped by a rush of bodies and borne over to the corner where I saw my patient. Bonzo was sitting upright in a ragged blanket. He was a large, shaggy animal of indeterminate breed, and though at a glance there didn't seem to be much ailing him, he wore a pathetic expression of self-pity. Since everybody was talking at once, I decided to ignore them and carry out my examination. I worked my way over the legs, pelvis, ribs, and spine. No fractures. His mucous membranes were a good color. There was no evidence of internal injury. In fact, the only thing I could find was slight bruising over the left shoulder. Bonzo had sat like a statue as I felt over him, but as I finished, he toppled over onto his side and lay looking up at me apologetically, his tail thumping on the blanket. "You're a big, soft dog, that's what you are," I said, and the tail thumped even faster. I turned and viewed the throng, and after a moment or two, I managed to pick out the parents. Mum was fighting her way to the front, while at the rear, Dad, a diminutive figure, was beaming at me over the heads. I did a bit of shushing, and when the babble died down, I addressed myself to Mrs. Dimmock. "I think he's been lucky," I said. "I can't find any serious injury. I think the car must have bowled him over and knocked the wind out of him for a minute, or he may have been suffering from shock." The uproar broke out again. "Will he die, mister? What's the matter with him? What are you going to do?" I gave Bonzo an injection of a mild sedative while he lay rigid, a picture of canine suffering, with the tousled heads looking down at him with deep concern and innumerable little hands poking out and caressing him. Mrs. Dimmock produced a basin of hot water, and while I washed my hands, I was able to make a rough assessment of the household. I counted 11 little Dimmocks, from a boy in his early teens down to a grubby-faced infant crawling around on the floor. And judging by the significant bulge in Mum's midriff, the number was soon to be augmented. They were clad in a motley selection of hand-me-downs, darned pullovers, patched trousers, tattered dresses, yet the general atmosphere in the house was of unconfined joie de vivre, joy of life. Bonzo wasn't the only animal, and I stared in disbelief as another biggish dog and a cat with 2 half-grown kittens appeared from among the crowding legs and feet. I would have thought that the problem of filling the human mouths would have been difficult enough without importing several animals. But the Dimmocks didn't worry about such things. They did what they wanted to do, and they got by. Dad, I learned later, had never done any work within living memory. He had a bad back and lived what seemed to me a reasonably gracious life, roaming interestedly around the town by day and enjoying a quiet beer and a game of dominoes in a corner of the Four Horseshoes by night. I saw him quite often. He was easy to pick out because he invariably carried a walking stick, which gave him an air of dignity, and he always walked briskly and purposely as though he were going somewhere important. I took a final look at Bonzo, still stretched out on the blanket, looking up at me with soulful eyes. Then I struggled towards the door. "I don't think there's anything to worry about," I shouted above the chattering, which had speedily broken out again, "but I'll look in on him tomorrow and make sure." When I drew up outside the house the next morning, I could see Bonzo lolloping around the garden with several of the children. They were passing a ball from one to the other, and he was leaping ecstatically high in the air to try to intercept it. He was clearly none the worse for his accident, but when he saw me opening the gate, his tail went down and he drooped almost to his knees and slunk into the house. The children received me rapturously. "You've made him better, mister. He's all right now, isn't he?" "He's 'ad a right big breakfast this morning, mister." I went inside with the little hands clutching at my coat. Bonzo was sitting bolt upright on the blanket in the same attitude as the previous evening, but as I approached, he slowly collapsed onto his side and lay looking up at me with a martyred expression. I laughed as I knelt by him. "You're the original old soldier, Bonzo, but you can't fool me. I saw you out there." I gently touched the bruised shoulder, and the big dog tremblingly closed his eyes as he resigned himself to his fate. Then, when I stood up and he realized that I wasn't going to have another ejection, he leapt to his feet and bounded away into the garden. A little faker, don't you think? There was a chorus of delighted cries from the Dimmocks, and they turned and looked at me with undisguised admiration. Clearly, they considered that I had plucked Bonzo from the jaws of death. Mr. Dimmock stepped forward from the mass. "You'll send me a bill, won't you?" he said, with the dignity that was peculiar to him. My first glance last night had decided me that this was a non-charging job, and I hadn't even written it in the book, but I nodded solemnly. "Very well, Mr. Dimmock, I'll do that." And throughout our long association, though no money ever changed hands, he always said the same thing: "You'll send me a bill, won't you?" This was the beginning of my close relationship with the Dimmocks. Obviously, they had taken a fancy to me and wanted to see as much as possible of me. Over the succeeding weeks and months, they brought in a variety section of dogs, cats, budgies, rabbits at frequent intervals, and when they found that my services were free, they stepped up the number of visits, and when one came, they all came. I was anxiously trying to expand the small animal side of my practice, and increasingly my hopes were raised momentarily, then dashed when I opened the door and saw a packed waiting room. And it increased the congestion when they started bringing their auntie, Mrs. Pounder, from down the road with them to see what a nice chap I was. Mrs. Pounder, a fat lady who always wore a greasy velour hat perched on an untidy mound of hair, evidently shared the family tendency to fertility, and usually brought a few of her own ample brood with her. That is how it was this particular morning. I swept the assembled company with my eye, but could discern only beaming Dimmocks and Pounders, and this time I couldn't even pick out my patient. Then the assembly parted and spread out as though by a prearranged signal, and I saw little Nellie Dimmock with a tiny puppy on her knee. Nellie was my favorite. Mind you, I liked all the family. In fact, they were such nice people that I always enjoyed their visits after that first disappointment. Mom and Dad were always courteous and cheerful, and the children, though boisterous, were never ill-mannered. They were happy and friendly, and if they saw me in the street, they would wave madly and go on waving till I was out of sight. And I saw them often because they were continually scurrying around the town doing odd jobs, delivering milk or papers. Best of all, they loved their animals and were kind to them. But, as I say, Nellie was my favorite. She was about 9 and had suffered an attack of infantile paralysis, as it used to be called when very young. It had left her with a pronounced limp and a frailty which set her apart from her robust brothers and sisters. Her painfully thin legs seemed almost too fragile to carry her around, but above the pinched face, her hair, the color of ripe corn, flowed to her shoulders, and her eyes, though slightly crossed, gazed out calm and limpid blue with steel-rimmed spectacles. "What's that you've got, Nellie?" I asked. "It's a little dog," she almost whispered. "He's mine." "You mean he's your very own?" She nodded proudly. "Aye, he's mine." "He doesn't belong to your brothers and sisters too?" "Nah, he's mine." Rows of Dimmock and Pounder heads nodded in eager acquiescence as Nellie lifted the puppy to her cheek and looked up at me with a smile of a strange sweetness. It was a smile that always tugged at my heart, full of a child's artless happiness and trust, but with something else which was poignant and maybe had to do with the way Nellie was. Well, he looks like a fine dog to me, I said. He's a spaniel, isn't he? She ran a hand over the little head. Aye, a cocker. Mr. Brown said he was a cocker. There was a slight disturbance at the back, and Mr. Dimmock appeared from the hush. He gave a respectful cough. He's a proper pure breed, Mr. Harriet, he said. Mr. Brown from the Banks female had a litter, and he gave this to Nellie. He tucked his stick under his arm and pulled a long envelope from an inside pocket. He handed it to me with a flourish. That is pedigree. I read it through and whistled softly. He's a real blue-blooded hound, all right, and I see he's got a big, long name. Darrowby Tobias III. My word, that sounds great. I looked down at the little girl again. And what do you call him, Nellie? Toby, she said softly. I call him Toby. I laughed. All right, then. What's the matter with Toby, anyway? Why have you brought him? He's been sick, Mr. Harriet. Mrs. Dimmocks spoke from somewhere among the heads. He can't keep nothing down. Well, I know what that'll be. Has he been wormed? No, I don't think so. I should think he just needs a pill, I said, but bring him through and I'll have a look at him. Other clients were usually content to send one representative through with their animals, but the Dimmocks all had to come. I marched along with the crowd behind me, filling the passage from wall to wall. Our consulting-cum-operating room was quite small, and I watched with some apprehension as the procession filed in after me. But they all got in, Mrs. Pounder, her velour hat slightly askew, squeezing herself in with some difficulty at the rear. My examination of the puppy took longer than usual, as I had to fight my way to the thermometer on the trolley, then struggle in the other direction to get the stethoscope from its hook on the wall. But I finished at last. Well, I can't find anything wrong with him, I said, so I'm pretty sure he just has a tummy full of worms. I'll give you a pill now, and you must give it to him first thing tomorrow morning. Like a football match turning out, the mass of people surged along the passage and into the street, and another Dimmock visit had come to an end. I forgot the instance immediately because there was nothing unusual about it. The pot-bellied appearance of the puppy made my diagnosis a formality. I didn't expect to see him again, but I was wrong. A week later, my surgery was once more overflowing, and I had another squished-in session with Toby in the little back room. My pill had evacuated a few worms, but he was still vomiting, still distended. Are you giving him 5 very small meals a day, as I told you? I asked. I received emphatic affirmative, and I believed them. The Dimmocks really took care of their animals. There was something else here, yet I couldn't find it. Temperature normal, lungs clear, abdomen negative on palpation. I couldn't make it out. I dispensed a bottle of our antacid mixture with a feeling of defeat. A young puppy like this shouldn't need such a thing. This was the beginning of a frustrating period. There would be a span of 2 or 3 weeks when I would think the trouble had righted itself. Then, without warning, the place would be full of Dimmocks and Pounders, and I'd be back to where I started. And all the time, Toby was growing thinner. I tried everything: gastric sedatives, variations of diet, quack remedies. I interrogated the Dimmocks repeatedly about the character of the vomiting, how long after eating, what were the intervals between, and I received varying replies. Sometimes he brought his food straight back. At others, he retained it for several hours. I got nowhere. It must have been over 8 weeks later, Toby would be about 4 months old, when I again viewed the dissembled Dimmocks with a sinking heart. Their visits had become depressing affairs, and I could not foresee anything better today as I opened the waiting room door and allowed myself to be almost carried along the passage. This time it was Dad who was the last to wedge himself into the consulting room. Then Nellie placed the little dog on the table. I felt an inward lurch of sheer misery. Toby had grown despite his disability and was now a grim caricature of a cocker spaniel, the long silky ears drooping from an almost fleshless skull, the spindly legs pathetically feathered. I had thought Nellie was thin, but her pet had outdone her. And he wasn't just thin, he was trembling slightly as he stood arched back on the smooth surface, and his face had the dull inward look of an animal which had lost interest. The little girl ran her hand along the jutting ribs, and the pale, squinting eyes looked up at me through the steel spectacles with that smile which pulled at me more painfully than ever before. She didn't seem worried. Probably she had no idea how things were, but whether she had or not, I knew I'd never be able to tell her that the dog was slowly dying. I rubbed my eyes wearily. "What has he had to eat today?" Nellie answered herself. "He had some bread and milk." "How long ago was that?" I asked, but before anybody could reply, the little dog vomited, sending the half-digested stomach contents soaring in a graceful arc to land 2 feet away on the table. I swung round on Mrs. Dimmocks. "Does he always do that?" "Aye, he mostly does. Send it flying out like." "But why didn't you tell me?" The poor lady looked flustered. "Well, I don't know." I held up a hand. "That's all right, Mrs. Dimmocks. Never mind." It occurred to me that all the way through my totally ineffectual treatment of this dog, not a single Dimmocks or Pounder had uttered a word of criticism, so why should I start to complain now? But I knew what Toby's trouble was now. At long last, I knew. And in any case, my present-day colleagues reading this may think I had been more than usually thick-headed in my handling of the case. I would like to offer in my defense that such limited textbooks as there were in those days made only a cursory reference to pyloric stenosis, narrowing of the exit of the stomach where it joins the small intestine. And if they did, they said nothing about treatment. But surely, I thought, somebody in England was ahead of the books. There must be people who were actually doing this operation, and if there were, I had a feeling one might not be too far away. I worked my way through the crush and trotted along the passage to the phone. "Is that you, Granville?" "Jim," a bellow of pure, unalloyed joy. "How are you, laddie?" "Very well. How are you?" "Absolutely tip-top, old son. Never better. Granville, I've got a 4-month-old spaniel pup I'd like to bring through to you. It's got pyloric stenosis." "Oh, lovely. I'm afraid the little thing just about on its last legs. A bag of bones." Splendid, splendid. This is because I've been mucking about for 4 weeks in ignorance." "Fine, just fine. And the owners are a very poor family. They can't pay anything, I'm afraid." "Wonderful." I hesitated a moment. "Granville, have you operated on these cases before?" "Did 5 yesterday." "What?" A deep rumble of laughter. "I do but jest, old son, but you needn't worry. I've done a few, and this isn't such a bad job." "Well, that's great." I looked at my watch. "It's 9:30 now. I'll get Siegfried to take over my morning round, and I'll see you before 11. Granville had called out when I arrived, and I hung around his surgery till I heard the expensive sound of the Bentley purring into the yard. Through the window I saw yet another magnificent pipe glinting behind the wheel, then my colleague in an impeccable pinstripe suit, which made him look like the governor of the Bank of England, paced majestically toward the side door. "Good to see you, Jim," he exclaimed, wringing my hand warmly. Then before removing his jacket, he took his pipe from his mouth and regarded it with a trace of anxiety for a second before giving it a polish with his yellow cloth and placing it tenderly in a drawer. It wasn't long before I was under the lamp in the operating room, bending over Toby's small, outstretched form, while Granville, the other Granville Bennett, worked with fierce concentration inside the abdomen of the little animal. "You see the gross gastric dilation," he murmured. "Classical lesion." He gripped the pylorus and poised his scalpel. "Now I'm going through the serious coat. A quick, deft incision, a bit of blunt dissection here for the muscle fibers. Down, down, a little more. Ah, yes, there it is. You can see it, the mucosa bulging into the cleft. Yes, just right. That's what you've got to arrive at." I peered down at the tiny tube which had been the site of all Toby's troubles. "Is that it, then?" "That's all, laddie." He stepped back with a grin. "The obstruction is relieved now, and you can take bets that this little chap will start to put weight on now." "That's wonderful, Granville. I'm really grateful." "Nonsense, Jim. It was a pleasure. You can do the next one yourself now, eh?" He laughed and seized needle and sutures and sewed up the abdominal muscles and the skin at an impossible pace. A few minutes later, he was in his office pulling on his jacket. Then as he filled his pipe, he turned to me. "I've got a little plan for the rest of the morning, laddie." I shrank away from him and threw up a protective hand. "Well, now, it's kind of you, Granville, but I honestly must get back. Very busy, you know. Can't leave Siegfried too long. Work'll be piling up." I stopped because I felt like I was beginning to gibber. My colleague looked wounded. "All I meant, old son, was that we want you to come to lunch. Zoe's expecting you." Oh, I see. "Well, that's very kind. We're not going anywhere else then?" "Anywhere else?" He blew out his cheeks and spread his arms wide. "Of course not. I just have to call in at my branch surgery on the way." "Branch surgery? I didn't know you had one." "Oh, yes, just a stone's throw from my house." He put an arm around my shoulders. "Well, let's go, shall we?" As I lay back, cradled in Bentley's luxury, I dwelt happily on the thought that at least I was going to meet Zoe Bennet when I was my normal self. She would learn this time that I wasn't perpetually drunken oaf. In fact, the next hour or two seemed full of rosy promise, an excellent lunch illumined by my witty conversation and polished manners, then back with Toby, magically resuscitated to Darrowby. I smiled to myself when I thought of Nellie's face when I told her her pet was going to be able to eat and grow strong and playful like any other pup. I was still smiling when the car pulled up on the outskirts of Granville's home village. I glanced idly through the window at a low stone building with leaded panes and a wooden sign dangling over the entrance. It read, "Old Oak Tree Inn." I turned quickly to my companion. "I thought we were going to your branch surgery." Granville gave me a smile of childish innocence. "Oh, that's what I call this place. It's so near home, and I transact quite a lot of business here." He patted my knee. "We'll just pop in for an appetizer, eh?" There he goes again, right, Bryce? Oh, my goodness, you can't trust the man. "Now, wait a minute," I stammered, gripping the sides of my seat tightly. "I just can't be late today. I'd much rather—" Granville raised a hand. Jim, laddie, we won't be in for long." He looked at his watch. "It's exactly 12:30, and I promised Zoe would be home by 1 o'clock. She's cooking roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, and it would take a braver man than me to let her pudding go flat. I guarantee we'll be in that house at 1 o'clock on the dot, okay?" I hesitated. I couldn't come to much harm in half an hour. I climbed out of the car. As we went into the pub, a large man who had been leaning on the counter turned and exchanged enthusiastic greetings with my colleague. Albert, cried Granville. "Meet Jim Harriet from Darrowby. Jim, this is Albert Wainwright, the landlord of the Wagon and Horses over in Motherley. In fact, he's the president of the Licensed Victualers Association this year, aren't you, Albert?" The big man grinned and nodded, and for a moment I felt overwhelmed by the two figures on either side of me. It was difficult to describe the hard, bulky tissue of Granville's construction, but Mr. Wainwright was unequivocally fat. I checked jacket hung open to display an enormous expanse of striped shirt abdomen overflowing the waistband of his trousers. Above a gay bow tie, cheerful eyes twinkled at me from a red face, and he spoke his tone, which was rich and fruity. He embodied the rich ambiance of the term licensed victualler. I began to sip at the half pint of beer I had ordered, but when another appeared in 2 minutes, I saw I was going to fall hopelessly behind and switched to the whiskeys and sodas which others were drinking. And my undoing was that both my companions appeared to have a standing account here. They downed their drinks, tapped softly on the counter, and said, "Yes, please, Jack," whereupon 3 more glasses appeared with magical speed. I never had a chance to buy a round. In fact, no money ever exchanged hands. It was a quiet, friendly little session with Albert and Granville, carrying on a conversation of the utmost good humor, punctuated by the almost soundless taps of the bar. And as I fought to keep up with the two virtuosos, the taps came more and more frequently until I seemed to hear them every few seconds. Granville was as good as his word. When it was nearly 1 o'clock, he looked at his watch. "Got to be off now, Albert. Zoe's expecting us right now." And as the car rolled to a stop outside the house, dead on time, I realized with a dull despair that it had happened to me again. Within me, a witch's brew was beginning to bubble. sending choking fumes into my brain. I felt terrible, and I knew for sure I would get rapidly worse. Granville, fresh and debonair as ever, leaped out and led me into the house. "Zoe, my love," he warbled, embracing his wife as she came through from the kitchen. When she disengaged herself, she came over to me. She was wearing a flowered apron, which made her look, if possible, more attractive. "Hello," she cried, and gave me that look which she shared with her husband, as though meeting James Herriot was an unbelievable boon. "Lovely to see you again. I'll get lunch now," I replied with a foolish grin, and she skipped away. Flopping into an armchair, I listened to Granville pouring steadily over the sideboard. He put a glass in my hand and sat in another chair. Immediately, the obese Staffordshire Terrier bounded onto his lap. "Phoebe, my little pet, Feebles, my little pet," he sang joyfully. "Daddykins is home again." And he pointed playfully at the tiny Yorkie who was sitting at his feet, baring her teeth repeatedly in a series of ecstatic smiles. "And I see you, my little Victoria, I see you." By the time I was ushered to the table, I was like a man in a dream, moving sluggishly, speaking with slurred deliberation. Granville poised himself over a vast sirloin, stopped his knife briskly, then began to hack away ruthlessly. He was a prodigal server and piled about 2 pounds of meat on my plate. Then he started on the Yorkshire puddings. Instead of a single big one, Zoe had made a large number of little round ones, as the farmers' wives often did. Delicious golden cups, crisply brown, round the sides. Granville heaped about 6 of these by the side of the meat as I watched stupidly. Then Zoe passed me the gravy boat. With an effort, I took a careful grip on the handle, closed one eye, and began to pour. For some reason, I felt I had to fill up each of the little puddings with gravy, and owlishly directed the stream into one and then another till they were all overflowing. Oh my! Once I missed and spilled a few drops on the fragrant liquid on the tablecloth. I looked up guiltily at Zoe and giggled. Zoe giggled back. And I had the impression that she felt, though I was a peculiar individual, there was no harm in me. I just had this terrible weakness that I was never sober day or night, but I wasn't such a bad fellow at heart. It usually took me a few days to recover from a visit to Granville, and by the following Saturday I was convalescing nicely. It happened that I was in the marketplace and saw a large concourse of people crossing the cobbles. At first I thought from the mixture of children and adults that it must be a school outing, but on closer inspection I realized it was only the Dimmocks and Pounders going shopping. When they saw me, they diverted their course, and I was engulfed by a human wave. "Look at him now, mister. He's eating like an oss now. He's going to get fat soon, mister." The delighted cries rang round me, Nellie and Toby on a lead, and as I bent over the little animal, I could hardly believe how a few days had altered him. He was still skinny, but the hopeless look had gone. He was perky, ready to play. It was just a matter of time now. His little mistress ran her hand again and again over the smooth brown coat. "You are proud of your little dog, aren't you, Nellie?" I said, and the gentle squinting eyes turned on me. "Yes, I am." She smiled that smile again, "because he's mine." I am so glad I got to see the Dimmocks family down on paper. They were some of the truest animal lovers I have ever known, and dealing with a crowd of them at one time, as I always did, give richness and warmth to every consultation. After seeing them, I used to feel strangely alone when meeting a solitary client. And of course, I had my wings signed, as always, when I came into contact with the immortal Granville Bennett. But to this day, I have never found a better way of relieving pyloric stenosis than the one he showed me. Well, that was a super long story. I hope you have time to read the whole thing. And love you. I miss you. Sending hugs, kisses, and I'll see you soon. Bye, Bryce.